MTP 202, the process of tie and dye. Unit 2, textures. Tie-dyed fabric or garments are folded into a variety of patterns and bound. The folds and the binds don't only make patterns but also create variety of textures. Binding, folding, crumpling fabric before dyeing it creates brilliant effects. In this unit, the students will be briefed about such methods. Objectives. After going through this unit, you will be able to different methods to create textures for tie and dye fabric, different methods of tying the fabric for creating these textures. Introduction. Tie-dye is a resist technique. The fabric is bound tightly. So when it is immersed in the dye color, certain areas resist the dye. The undyed areas form decorative patterns against the dyed ones. Marbling. As an introduction to the craft of tie and dye, a few experiments with marbling are a must. They are a stimulating and rewarding way of proving to the beginners that when cloth is bunched up closely and bound with thread or string before being dyed, uneven dyeing and in some parts complete resistance to dye is caused. Little or no skill is required for this exercise and the results are largely by chance. It is a valuable means of finding out the effects produced when a second or third color is dyed over the first. The multicolored and irregular cloud-like textures which is dyed on the cloth by the marbling technique can be quite attractive without further additions, but it provides a rich and unusual background for prints, stencils, embroidery, etc. After the sample has been marbled, it can be tied up again into a definite design and dyed a darker or contrasting color so that the resist areas the marbled texture shows through instead of the plain white cloth. For instance, if large-scale circles are bound up on a previously marbled background and the sample is then dyed a darker color, the effects produced is one of the textured circles on the background. This is the first of your self-check questions. What is marbling? I would want you people to discuss this in the class. After you have done the question number 1, please go on to question number 2. What type of textures do we get in marbling technique? If you have answered these questions or discussed them amongst yourself, let us continue. Method. Take a piece of cloth about the size of a handkerchief or smaller and gather up into a ball or bundle into the palm of the hand, keeping the right side of the cloth to the outside. Bind the bundle round and round in all directions with threads or string until it is a hard, solid mass. Fasten off the binding thread, leaving one end about 6 inches long, which can be held while the bundle is lowered into the dye bath. Immerse the bundle in the dye for a few seconds only. The longer it is left, the more dye penetrates into the folds of the cloth. Squeeze out the surplus dye from the bundle and rinse. Untie before or after dyeing. If the texture is not evenly distributed, tie up the sample again and dye the same color as before. For a second or third color, repeat the whole process of bunching and tying. Whenever retying, try to arrange the cloth not already textured to be placed near the surface or the outside, while the areas that need no further patterning are tucked away in the center of the bundle. If after this there are still large patches of cloth that have missed the dye completely, rearrange the bundle so that the bare patches project on the outside. Bind and dye again, or apply the dye with a brush. Previously dyed thread may be used for the binding. Activity. Make square cushion cover with marbling technique. Twisting and coiling. This texture is more definite in character than marbling and is more evenly spaced over the cloth, whereas marbling can be employed to different specific areas of a sample. The whole length of cloth must be immersed in the dye when making a texture by the twisting and coiling techniques. Method. Keeping the right side outside, bring the two salvage edges of the cloth together to form a tube lengthwise. Gather up each end of the tube and tie separately with thread. For a smaller sample, this is not essential. An end can be held in either hand while the tube is twisted into a cord. Another method is to attach one end to a stationary object and then proceed to twist the tube until it begins to coil back on itself to make a cord. Fold the tube in half and tie the two ends together. Regulate the coils of the cord. Bind round the cord, beginning and finishing at the open end. Dye for a few seconds, squeeze out surplus dye, rinse and dry. Before untying, further binding may be added. and a second color dyed. The two ends of the cord may be dyed in different colors if required. Then rinse, dry and untie. If the texture is not well distributed, the tying up may be repeated, rearranging the parts that have not been dyed on the outer side and then dye as before. Now this is the second activity. Make a table mat of 12 by 8 inches each with the help of twisting and coiling techniques. Do the practical. Summing up. As the name suggests, the technique of tie and dye involves two stages. Tying sections of a length of cloth and then dip it into color. Tie and dye is a resist method of patterning fabric that is achieved by withholding dye from certain areas of the fabric. This leaves the original undyed area as the background or vice versa. This method can be used to combine lots of color by tying and covering certain areas according to the effect desired. Thereafter, the fabric opens out into amazing designs and textures. Now let me give you the possible answers to the two self-check questions I had asked you. For the answer of the first question, marbling is a way of bunching up the cloth closely and binding with thread or string before being dyed, resulting in uneven dyeing. In some parts, complete resistance to the dye is cast. The second answer was, we get textured fabric on the background. The terminal questions for the day today, the second part is, what do you understand by the resist? Describe the method of marbling in details. Please go home and try to work out these answers. Thank you.